Hey everybody out there, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. Thank you for joining me for our limited set review of Ravnica Allegiance, set that's going to be coming out this weekend. I don't think I'll get through every single guild video by the time the pre-release starts, but hopefully I'll give you enough information with the few videos I do get out that you'll have a good start to your first couple drafts or your pre-release weekend. Keep in mind, this is a limited set review, so we're not talking about constructed applications, but we will be going over each and every card in the set as it pertains to draft or sealed. The structure here is going to be the same as Guilds of Ravnica, or at least my set reviews will be, where I will look at a single guild per video, and within those videos I'll be looking at two things. I will look at all of the gold cards that fall within that guild, as well as all the monocolored cards that carry the guild mechanic of that guild. So for Rakdos, which will be starting us off here, we'll be looking at all the gold cards, all of the red-black cards, as well as all of the spectacle cards. Spectacle is Rakdos' mechanic for the set, and it works a lot like Bloodthirst, where it incentivizes you to deal damage to the opponent. If I say Bloodthirst in this video, forgive me, because the applications are kind of similar. So if you look at the example below, Spectacle is an alternative casting cost, and you may use that casting cost only if your opponent has lost life that turn. Most of the time that'll be through dealing combat damage to the opponent, but burn spells will do the trick, having them just lose life will do the trick, and occasionally if they pay life for an effect during your turn, that'll turn on your Spectacle cards. Spectacle is sometimes more expensive, which adds an ability to the card you're casting, or Spectacle gives you a cheaper casting cost, which gives you an alternative, cheaper way of just casting that spell for the turn, but keep in mind that you have to have dealt damage or have your opponent lose life during the turn for Spectacle to even be a factor. What this means is that Spectacle decks, or Rakdos decks in general, will be two-parters. You will have your Spectacle cards, and you will need to enable them by dealing damage to your opponent, which Rakdos has a lot of ways to do. However, of course, you'll be dealing combat damage to your opponent throughout the course of the game, as most games go, and if you can consistently do that, then you should be able to spectacle your cards out for value. This is a little different than the other guild mechanics that we'll see, since they all work kind of in a vacuum on their own. For example, Afterlife cards are just going to do their own thing. Adapt doesn't require anything extra other than pay and mana. But Spectacle does not work on its own. It requires that you kind of set it up, even though it has a fairly easy way to set up if you're just playing a normal game of Magic. And we'll see that they've enabled it quite a bit with some of the cards. So we get to skip over the sideboard and build around cards here because Rakdos really doesn't have a lot of those. And remember, I'm going to do this by category, starting off with the low-picked playables. These are cards that you're not super excited to have in your draft deck, and you're not picking them up early in the pack, but they'll make the cut some amount of the time. You're just not looking to get them. You're looking to wheel them if you're actually trying to play them at all. So our first card here, the Rafter Demon that we saw just a second ago, is 2 black and red for a 4/2 demon. It is a common, and the spectacle cost here is 3 black and red, so it actually costs 1 more to spectacle it out. But when it enters the battlefield, if you paid its spectacle cost, each opponent discards a card. So let's just go ahead and evaluate this without spectacle for a second. 4 mana 4/2 in 2 colors is a bad card. 4 mana 4/2 in 1 color is a bad card. So Rafter Demon not looking very good off the bat. And the spectacle cost doesn't add too much to it. It does make it a 2-for-1, so if you have a choice between either just casting this or spectacling it out, and you've dealt damage to your opponent and you're not doing much else for the turn, then yeah, it's a nice little bonus, but it's also the type of card that really doesn't cut it if you're not using the spectacle cost, which leads it to it being a little bit of a lower playable card. We'll see this with a lot of spectacle cards. If they're good without the spectacle cost, then they're just good, right? But if they absolutely need spectacle to be good, then they take a little bit of a hit here, and I think that's what's happening with the Rafter Demon. Footlight Fiend is next up, and this is part of a cycle here, which we also saw in Guilds of Ravnica. There is 1 hybrid colored creature for each color pair. So the Rakdos one here is a single red or black mana, although you could play it in Orzhov or you could play it in Gruul. It's just going to be at its best in Rakdos. In the case of Footlight Fiend, it's a 1 mana 1/1. It's a common devil creature, and when it dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. So it's a fine card, not super exceptional. 1 mana 1/1 is okay, but it does a couple things here. First off, it can trade off for your opponent's 2 toughness creatures, since it deals 1 in combat, and you can use its ability to trade off the creature. So having a 1-drop that trades for an opponent's 2-drop is just fine. On the other hand, this is a way to almost guarantee that you're going to have Spectacle for a turn, since your opponent either doesn't block it and takes 1 combat damage, or they block it and you can use its ability to ping the opponent, turn it on Spectacle for the rest of the turn. I imagine that's why the design of the card is here, and we saw similar designs when Bloodthirst was around in the 2 sets that Bloodthirst has been in. With that being said, it's still not a super exciting card, and it takes a little bit of a hit for being quite poor outside of Rakdos, but it is a nice enabler for Rakdos decks, and if you end up drafting a deck with a bunch of Spectacle cards, then I think Footlight Fiend goes up in value for your deck. Drill Bit is next, haha, funny name. 2 and a black for an uncommon sorcery. Your opponent reveals their hand, and you take a non-land card from it and discard it. So, Thoughtseize with no drawback, no life gain. Or rather life loss, right? And the upside here is that you can Spectacle this for a black. Now, I think this card is probably about medium. If you play it in a deck, it's always going to hit something. It's going to take away a card, but I'm still never a huge fan of 1-for-1 discard, even when it's about as versatile as discard gets, right? This isn't Duress or Despise that can only take a certain subset of cards, so it's very unlikely that it misses, but hey, I'm not a big fan of cards like Never Happened or even cheap discard spells that cost 2 mana when it comes to limited. The thing is, you're spending 3 mana for a discard spell, and your opponent is not spending any mana on the card that you're getting rid of, so it's kind of a proactive way of getting rid of a potential threat, but sometimes you play Drill Bit and your opponent's just beating you down, right? Discard is very bad top deck most of the time, and the Spectacle cost doesn't really save this so much, since you can't actually cast it on turn 1 even with Spectacle. You need to deal damage and then cast this card as well, which means the earliest you can do it is turn 2, and sure, I guess this is fine on turn 2 or 3. It goes way up in value in sealed for what it's worth, but we're mostly talking about draft in this video. Rakdos Trumpeter is next, and this is another cycle of cards, one that I don't believe we saw in Guilds of Ravnica. So each color pair has a mono-colored creature with an activated ability that pushes it into the second color for that guild. So for example, Rakdos Trumpeter is a mono-black card. You could play in any of the black guilds, but you lose the advantage of the activated ability if you're not playing it in Rakdos. In the case of this card, the activated ability is not too great. It's 3 and a red to give +2/+0 until end of turn, and the creature has Menace. So a 2 mana, 1/3 Menace again is here to kind of nod towards Spectacle. Menace creatures on turn 2 are often going to go unblocked on turn 3, and that means you're very likely to just get in your damage for the turn, even if it's a small amount of damage, and turn on your Spectacle cards. This is more of an enabler than it is just a good card, since the Fire Breathing ability I think is a little bit overpriced, but that's the point, right? They didn't want to make this too strong as a common that fits in too many different decks. I think the card is fine. It's similar to Footlight Fiend, where if you absolutely need to turn Spectacle on for it to be a functional deck, then you'll play this card, but it's not exceptional, and the activated ability is quite expensive. Spike Wheel Acrobat is a card I'm excited to lose to at some point. It's 3 and a red for a 5/2. It is a common human rogue, and it has Spectacle for 2 and a red, so you get a mana discount on a 5/2 creature here. That looks really exciting, and sometimes this card will beat your face in, but 2 toughness creatures for 3 or more mana are not exactly cards I'm super excited about. We've seen 4 mana 5/2 in a lot of sets, and I can't recall a set where that's actually been good. I'm thinking Hulking Devil, I'm thinking Cobble Brew, and similar cards that have just never really shined in any format, mostly because a 2 toughness creature is going to trade off for your opponent's 2-drop very often, and there are a lot of good bears in this set to just trade off with the Acrobat. Getting it for 1 mana cheaper is nice, but you do have to enable that, and it's not too hard. You can kind of see just on screen a curve of something like Footlight Fiend into Rakdos Trumpeter into turn 3 Acrobat, gives you a very aggressive start, and then your other Spectacle cards kind of snowball out of control where you've just got enough presence on board to threaten your opponent and deal damage consistently turn after turn. So Spike Wheel Acrobat is not a bad card. It's just one that you shouldn't expect to get the full 5 damage in every turn, and you should be willing to trade it off fairly early. If you're not spectacling this card out onto the board, I don't like it very much at all, but if you do get it for 3 mana, you could certainly do worse than 5 power for 3 mana. Alright, our medium power level cards. So, just for the record, you're not going to see a lot of low power level cards in the guild-specific videos. When we get to the kind of mono-colored videos that have the non-guild-specific cards, we'll see a lot more kind of filler material. But as far as gold cards and cards that are meant to make decks tick go, we're not going to see too many low power level cards. So, starting off with our middle of the pack cards, we have Acrobat. Get it? It's 1 black red for a 2/3 uncommon human rogue, and it has spectacle for black red. So right off the bat, 3 mana 2/3 is not that great of a card, but 2 mana 2/3 is above the curve. So already spectacle gives you a decent discount on a 2 mana creature here that otherwise would be kind of just a weaker below the curve vanilla. Thankfully, Acrobat, regardless of whether you spectacle this card or cast it for the full price, has 2 really good activated abilities. The first one, for a single black mana, gives it Death Touch, and we will see a lot of Death Touch in this set once again. And for a red mana, it gets +2/-2 until end of turn. So it's a nice little, lesson in threat of activation. If you attack with it, your opponent probably can't block with small creatures, since it's going to have 3 toughness really early on. Otherwise, you just pay a black mana and you trade off. If they block with a bigger creature, you pay a black mana and they trade off. And if they don't block at all, you pay a red mana and you get in more damage for the turn. I like the design of the card. It can play offensively and defensively due to Death Touch. And it has a nice combination of Spectacle and 2 relevant activated abilities, even though I don't think the card is incredible, since it's never dealt more than 4 damage, and it is vulnerable to a lot more removal once you activate the red activated ability. Rakdos Roustabout is next. It's 1 black-red for a common 3/2 Ogre Warrior. When it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So this is a little confusing because it sounds like abilities we've seen in the past. It's easy to read this as something similar to Ornery Goblin, where it deals damage to the blocking creature, but that's not how it works. It actually deals damage to your opponent, regardless of what is blocking the Roustabout, and it deals 1 damage for each creature blocking it. So if they have to throw 2 1/1 spirit tokens in front of the Roustabout deals 2 damage to the opponent right away. The creature will still trade off, of course. This isn't pinging those creatures, it's pinging the opponent. And what this means is you have a nearly unblockable source of damage for the turn, similar to the Footlight Fiend, where if your opponent doesn't straight up use a removal spell on the Roustabout, you're more than likely getting damage in no matter what, which turns on Spectacle, and so on and so forth. You get to kind of go off with your turn. Roustabout is going to be a nice card against the Defender or Wall-based decks, which is going to be a, I think, potent strategy against Rakdos to try and shut him out of dealing damage turn after turn. Roustabout gets around that, and while it doesn't deal a lot of damage, it deals consistent damage, which is probably going to be more important for these Spectacle decks. Blade Juggler is up next, 4 and a black for a 3/2 common human rogue with Spectacle for 2 and a black. It has the same ability whether you Spectacle it or not. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to you, and you draw a card. So this card ranges in power level quite a bit based on whether or not you can Spectacle it. For 5 mana, it's a very just okay, and if it didn't have Spectacle at all, I would put this card in the low power level. It's almost identical to something like Rafter Demon, where you're getting a 2-for-1 on a very overpriced, weaker body, but this card has a cheaper Spectacle cost, and if you can consistently get this out for 3 mana, it's a very good card. So it kind of falls in the middle for me because you can't always 100% rely on being able to have Spectacle for a turn, but you can always hold this card for a turn when you do, and it replaces itself right away, which Rakdos is going to want to do. Rakdos is going to be all in a good percentage of the time, and having creatures that just cantrip while adding more power to the board seems very good to me. So I like Blade Juggler, but I'm being realistic about my expectations with Spectacle, where you cannot rely on having it 100% of the time, but you can build your deck in a way with these cards like Roustabout that you can reliably get your Spectacle most of the time. Light Up the Stage was the first card we saw from this set. It's 2 and a red for an uncommon sorcery with Spectacle for a single red. The effect is exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. So you get kind of a red divination here for 3 mana, and you have until the end of your next turn to play the cards. Notice it says play, not cast, so you can play lands, assuming you haven't already played your land for the turn. And if you completely whiff on this and hit 2 lands, at least you make your land drops for this turn and the following turn, since they stay exiled for a total of 1 turn. I don't think this card is anything to write home about, since it is basically like a divination with a clock on it, right? You have exactly 2 turns to play the cards that you get, which divination would just give you until the end of the game to play the cards that you get. However, this card goes up in value because of Spectacle. If you're paying 3 mana, it's a pretty average draw spell, although it's something red doesn't always get, and I like that. But for Spectacle, this card is quite good, and for 1 red mana, you can often play this card for its Spectacle cost and cast 1 or 2, maybe both the spells that you exile with the effect. So I like it, but I'm not quite sure at this point how highly we're taking it and how reliable you can get Spectacle going in these decks. Dead Revels is 3 and a black for a common sorcery. It has Spectacle for 1 and a black, so you're saving half of the cost of this card by Spectacle on it. And the effect is one we've seen before: return up to 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. So I think the last time we saw this was Soul Salvage in Dominaria, which turned out to be a pretty good card. I like this sort of effect in very aggressive decks, and I like this effect in controlling decks, since in controlling decks you tend to have better late game creatures. You might have a bomb or 2, and having an extra copy of those bombs, essentially, if they get dealt with, is quite nice. In aggressive decks, this is going to be a draw 2, and you should be able to Spectacle it out more often. This is very similar to the Blade Juggler, where if you're casting it for full price, I think it's a little bit on the weaker side, since you're going to cast it and probably pass the turn without playing either of the creatures you get back. But if you can Spectacle it out, it's much more likely that you pay 2 mana for the Dead Revels, and then you're able to still keep up enough mana to cast one of the creatures you get back. And that's why I think it's a better suited card for aggro decks, but it still does the trick in control decks as well. Macabre Mockery is very interesting, and after reading this card and doing a preview of this video, I think Macabre Mockery deserves to be a little bit higher than I'm ranking it right now due to its flexibility. The card is 2 black-red for an uncommon instant, and it has a strange effect. It says, put target creature from an opponent's graveyard under the battlefield under your control. It gets +2/+0, gains haste until end of turn, and you sack it at the beginning of the next end step. So obviously the tier 3.5 way of using this card is to cast it at sorcery speed, get a creature back, attack them, and then sacrifice it. You're basically using it as a little bit of a burn spell in that case. But it's an instant, which means you can use it as a combat trick as well. And if your opponent has any spicy enter the battlefield triggers in their graveyard, you get to get those benefits as well. Plus, it works with Afterlife, since you're going to sacrifice the creature at the next end step. You're going to get whatever tokens you would normally get off of their Afterlife card. So I imagine this is going to play very well against Orzhov, but it should just play generally well against everything. There's also the little trick you should be aware of where you can cast this during your opponent's end step and keep the creature until the end of your next turn, since it sacrifices at the beginning of the next end step. So cast it during your opponent's end step if you want to be able to attack with it and still have maybe some sort of trickery during your opponent's end step. It's hard to evaluate, but it's flexible enough, especially as a Rakdos card. It almost doesn't even feel like a Rakdos card due to its kind of like tricky nature, but I think it's going to play out quite well, and I think it does deserve to probably be in the high power level category. Our first split card here highlights kind of how the split cards work, very similar, in fact, exactly similar to the Guilds of Ravnica split cards. Carnival, in this case, is a single black-red hybrid mana, so 1 mana for an instant. This is the uncommon split card. It deals 1 damage to target creature or planeswalker and 1 damage to that permanent's controller. So a lot of times this will be able to just ping off a small creature or finish off a creature that's already gotten in combat and then deal damage to the opponent. Similar to the Footlight Fiend we saw at the beginning of the video, this is just a reliable way to make sure you get damage on the opponent for the turn, and it's cheap enough that you should be able to spectacle some cards out afterwards. So it's more of an enabler than it is a reliable removal spell since it only deals 1 damage, but hey, if your opponent's playing a bunch of X1s, this card goes way up in value. Carnage is the other side. 2 black and a red for a sorcery that deals 3 damage to target opponent, and they discard 2 cards. So basically, Blightning here for 4 mana instead of 3. And Blightning is a pretty punishing card to have someone play against you. It feels terrible. This is less of a spectacle enabler since it already cost 4 mana to cast this card, and more of just a solid card to put in your deck. If you're playing the burn beatdown plan or you're all in and super aggressive, this is a nice flexibility of cards to have. You have a spectacle enabler on one half that can ping off really small creatures, and you have a burn spell with some disruptive elements on the second half, so you can determine which half is better to cast. Either way, they trigger spectacle for the turn and allow you to cast your spells for hopefully cheaper. And Carnage actually has nice upside. I'm not a huge fan of Mind Rot effects and just making my opponent discard cards, but you have to admit there are times where someone Mind Rots your last 2 cards out of your hand and your whole game plan falls to pieces. So Carnage can do that, and it's probably going to feel pretty brutal when someone casts it against you. And here we are at the high power level cards. These aren't quite the bombiest of the bombs here, but they're the cards you're hoping to fill your deck up with. You're hoping to get past them after opening a bomb, and you're pretty excited when they make the cut. The first one is Cult Guild Mage, and we see a cycle of Guild Mages that follow the same criteria as the Guilds of Ravnica Guild Mages with tap abilities. This one is Black-Red for a 2/2 uncommon human shaman. The first effect I already like on its own. It's 3 and a black, tap it, target player discards a card, but only at sorcery speed. If it didn't even have the second ability, I'd be okay playing that card. I like having 2 mana 2/2s that just have disruptive abilities attached to them, and being able to make your opponent just discard over time is going to play very well against Azorius, which is going to be using a lot of its mana to hold up instants some amount of the time, and is probably pretty good against Simic, which is going to use a lot of its mana to activate adapt abilities, thus probably not casting a ton of the cards out of their hand too often. So using the Cult Guild Mage to kind of pick away your opponent's hand over time seems decent, even if it is kind of a late game plan. The second ability for 1 red allows you to tap the Guild Mage and deal 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. Can't hit creatures, but you get the idea here. It's a spectacle enabler, and probably the most consistent turn-to-turn spectacle enabler that you can ask for. I feel like if you are drafting Rakdos and you have a bunch of spectacle cards, the Guild Mage might be priority number 1 for your deck. If you end up with, say, around 10 spectacle cards, then you're probably first picking the Cult Guild Mage out of your second or third pack. It is that consistent, and your opponent's going to have to either deal with this or deal with a flurry of spectacle cards. So altogether, great bear. Definitely fits what Rakdos wants to do. I think you'll be picking it highly, plus the little J-Stall is adorable. Come on. Fireblade Artist is next, another 2 mana 2/2 for black and red. It is a uncommon human shaman, and this one has haste. So 2 mana 2/2 haste is probably something you're in the market for when you're drafting your aggro beatdown Rakdos deck. And it has a sweet little ability. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may sacrifice a creature, which includes this if you want to sacrifice the artist. When you do, it deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. So again, similar to the Cult Guild Mage, you can't hit creatures, but the point is this is a consistent way and a very difficult to stop way of dealing damage to the opponent directly, thus enabling spectacle. Everything I said about the Cult Guild Mage's second ability applies to the Fireblade Artist, although the artist is a good way at chipping your opponent down once you've already beaten them down. So it's a little bit better of a top deck than just a 2 mana 2/2 haste would be in the long game. If you can really blitz your opponent out and get them down to, say, 6 to 8 life, the Fireblade Artist is the type of card that can finish them off and make it very difficult for them to stop. On top of that, this card seems very splashable with Orzhov, maybe making a little bit of a Mardu shell, where you use the sacrifice ability to sacrifice your afterlife tokens, deal damage to your opponent, and then just get in damage over time and overlap with Orzhov. Captive Audience. Okay, so this is a really exciting one, and I should probably preface my review of it by saying that I think this card is an absolute bomb, but it doesn't necessarily play out with how Rakdos is going to want to play out. So first things first, let's read the card. It's 5 black, red, 7 mana for a mythic rare enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you give it to an opponent. So once your opponent has it, this effect applies to them. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose one that has been chosen. Your life total becomes 4. Discard your hand. Each opponent creates 5 2/2 zombie creature tokens. In other words, your opponents are going to now kill you, right? And you get to choose how they kill you. First off, if you're playing against Rakdos, the last thing you want to do is put your life total at 4. We've already seen cards, probably every card on this list, that just deals damage directly, and putting yourself at 4 is almost a death wish unless you have a plan. Discarding your hand just means you don't have options anymore. You're top decking, and you're stuck with what you have on board. And honestly, I'm not sure if it's the most powerful or least powerful ability on the card. Giving your opponent 5 2/2s is going to be enough to kill you, right? So keep in mind, even though it says beginning of your upkeep, this applies to whoever controls the captive audience. So you give it to your opponent, and suddenly they have to make one of these decisions each turn until all 3 decisions have been made, after which it just kind of sits on board not doing anything. But honestly, if you resolve this card and you don't kill your opponent, you probably deserve to lose that match. It is one of those cards that you might read as like suspend 3, win the game, and they can kind of pilot it to a position where they might be able to still win the game, but it seems very unlikely in anything other than just a normally stable board, right? If you're stable against them, if you've been doing anything in Rakdos that whole time, then you're probably going to win this game. Now here's the kicker. It's a 7 mana card in a deck that probably wants to cast most of its spells around 2 to 4 mana, right? We have not seen basically anything on this list that costs more than 3 or 4 mana unless you're casting it for its spectacle cost, and there's a reason for that. Rakdos is built to be hyper aggressive. It's built to deal direct damage. It's kind of your Boros of the set. It's all in, and once you get to the late game, you don't want to draw expensive cards. So Captive Audience might actually be better as a splash card in an Orzhov deck or a Gruul deck, or heck, even a Gate deck or something along those lines. So I do think the card is bomb territory. I think it's going to win a lot of the games it resolves in, but it's also the type of card you probably shouldn't even play in your dedicated Rakdos deck, since most of those are going to curve out around 4 to 5 mana, and a 7 mana enchantment really messes up your mana base. Enough about Captive Audience, let's talk about a much simpler card to evaluate. Bedevil is black, black, red for a rare instant, and it's pretty simple. Destroy target artifact, creature, or planeswalker. So we should mention that there are not a lot of artifacts in this set, and there are very few that you even want to destroy in the first place. Majority of the artifacts that are in this set are weird mana rocks or lockets, which are weird mana rocks. So basically, the way I read this for 95% of games that you play is black, black, red, destroy target creature, and for 3 mana, you don't get much better of a deal. 2 things to say about this. First off, there is a lot of removal in black and red, but outside of a common that we'll see here in a second, there is not a lot of unconditional removal. It's all very situational, and a lot of it's really expensive as well. So having a 3 mana unconditional way to just straight up kill a creature is nice. But the second thing, and the problem with this card, is that it's a little bit inflexible as far as what colors you can play it in. This is not the type of card that you can take and splash in a Gruul deck. Maybe you can splash in an Orzhov deck, but even then, it's very color committal with black, black, red in its mana cost, no generic mana at all. So be careful if you take this. If you're taking this, you're basically committing yourself to Rakdos, which, based on the cards we've seen so far, might not be a bad place to be. Rakdos Firewheeler is our black, black, red, red card of the set. The CCDD cycle is back here, and the Firewheeler is a house. It's 4/3, uncommon human rogue for 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to target opponent and 2 damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker. So obviously, very nice card. It tends to probably pick off small creatures, maybe even finish off some bigger ones. Keep in mind, your opponent's going to be incentivized to block your creatures in Rakdos a lot because of the threat of spectacle. So sometimes you can jam a 2/2 into a 3/3 and your opponent feels obligated to block, which opens up the opportunity for you to play a card like Firewheeler and finish off their bigger creature with its ability. Now, this is less of a spectacle enabler than some of the other cards we've seen, since it does cost 4 mana on its own, and as we've already talked about, casting the expensive cards to enable your spectacle isn't going to work too often, since they're going to use up most of your mana in the first place. But on its own, even in a vacuum without spectacle being considered, Fire Wheeler is a great card, and I'm very happy to take it when I'm in Rakdos, even if, similar to Bedevil, you're not going to be able to splash it in other decks very often. Get the point? Haha. 3 black red for a common instant. Pretty simple. Destroy target creature, scry 1. Scry 1 doesn't exactly do anything special in Rakdos, but it's a nice benefit on a card that you're happy to play anyway. Yes, this is 5 mana, but 5 mana makes it more splashable, so this is a card that you're probably happy to play in your Orzhov and Gruul decks, and I imagine this will go very quickly in the packs. It's similar to Deadly Visit. I'm not entirely sure whether it's better or worse than Deadly Visit, but instant speed is a big upgrade to a sorcery speed 5 mana kill spell, even if Surveil 2 is definitely better than Scry 1. Scry 1, again, not really doing as much as Surveil 2 would do in a Dimir deck, but it's a nice bonus attached to this card, and you're playing as many copies of this card as you can get your hands on. Skewer the Critics, great name, is 2 and a red for a common sorcery with Spectacle for a single red, and the effect, pretty great, deals 3 damage to any target. Basically, any set that's had a 3 mana, deal 3 to any target, whether it's sorcery or instant, has always been great. I can't think of a set that's had 3 mana, 3 damage, even at sorcery speed, and that card has not been one of the top red cards in the set. In this case, I think that's still going to be consistently true here, and the fact that you add Spectacle on top of it is nice. Now, even if you have to pay 3 mana to just kill a creature and that's all you do for the turn, this card is still going to be great, but the Spectacle on top of it means that you're often going to be able to kill a creature and still have mana to cast either a bigger spell or more Spectacle spells. So, Skewer the Critic, even if it didn't have Spectacle, would be a high pick in my opinion, and Spectacle adds to the power and flavor of the card. Rixmati Reveler is a nice Spectacle card here with a more expensive Spectacle cost. Without Spectacle, it is 1 and a red for a 2-2, so a 2 mana 2-2, and when it enters the battlefield, you discard a card, then draw a card. We should probably stop and note that that is not an optional ability, so if you play this and you have 1 card left in your hand, you better make sure that you're willing to discard that card because you don't honestly have a choice. Rixmati Reveler, 2 mana 2-2 that rummages, not necessarily loots, but rummages when it enters battlefield. That's already an okay card, but not rare power level, right? Well, let's go ahead and read Spectacle here. The Spectacle cost is 2 black red, putting it into a second color. And when it enters the battlefield, if you paid its Spectacle cost, you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. Obviously, the best way to do this is wait until this is the last card in your hand, Spectacle it out, and draw 3 cards. But again, I have to be realistic about how often that's going to happen. It's easy to think best case scenario that that'll just always happen, but sometimes you'll still have 2 cards left in your hand and you'll have to trade 2 cards for 3 cards, which is a lot less card advantage than straight up drawing 3, but hey, you'll take what you can get, right? Having that on a 2-drop is really nice, and a 2 mana 2-2 is already an okay deal that you'll put in a deck. Putting the Spectacle on top of this, I think pushes it over the edge, and it's just below what I would consider bomb territory, which you'll see when we get to those cards here in just a second. And finally, we have our split rare card, Bedeck, and a Bedazzle. Okay, not sure what Bedeck means, but hey, the card's just fine. It's 2 black-red hybrid mana, so any combination of 2 black or red mana. Instant speed, target creature gets +3, -3 until end of turn. This is almost an instant speed Skewer the Critics. It can't go to your opponent's face since it's not a burn spell, and sometimes it won't kill the biggest creatures that you want to kill, but it's efficient enough at 2 mana to deal with basically any combination, anything from like a 1 to a 4-drop. And it's going to do that pretty well. Plus, it has the rare application, which comes up very, very rarely, of being able to pump a high toughness creature and deal extra damage. But if we're being completely honest, this is just a removal spell with a weird name. And the hybrid nature of the mana cost means that you'll probably play it in Gruul decks and Orzhov decks too. So decent first pick if you want removal, but not extraordinary, especially when we put it side by side with Skewer the Critics. This is also one of the split cards where the second half is not very good. Bedazzle is 4 black-red for an instant, destroy target non-basic land, and it deals 2 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. Now, if the effect was something other than destroying a land, this would probably be a little bit better, but we don't care too much in Limited, especially this set, about killing our opponent's non-basics, especially when it deals 6 damage. And sure, there's some burn damage attached to it, which means this could be a very expensive 6-mana shock. But if your goal is to get your opponent dead, and you fill your deck with these incidental burn spells, which we've seen quite a few of, then maybe Bedazzle comes down and deals enough damage to kill your opponent. It doesn't kill creatures, which I think is a little bit weird for a 6-mana instant rare, but Bedeck already does that, so it's just flexibility on a card that you're already willing to take fairly highly. And now we do get to talk about those first pick bombs. These are the best of the best when it comes to Rakdos, and we'll start things off with Judith, the Scourge Diva. Judith is 1 black-red for a 2/2 rare, legendary human shaman, and the first ability says other creatures you control get +1/+0. Now, completely ignoring the rest of the text, I would already take this card extremely highly, since having an Anthem effect that pumps power on all of your other creatures in a color combination that already wants to be super aggressive is quite nice. Imagine if this was a Boros card in Guilds of Ravnica, and you just tweak the colors around to work in Boros. It would be amazing, and I feel like it's going to play out extremely well in Rakdos. The second ability is great too. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith deals 1 damage to any target. That includes Judith dying, but remember that's non-token, and it doesn't count your opponent's creatures dying, just yours. But the fact that it can go to any target is quite nice. So again, you have a bit of a spectacle enabler here if you lose creatures. So if you have ways to sacrifice your own creatures, or if they just naturally die in combat, your opponent uses removal, whatever, you get to start throwing pings around. Although you should often expect Judith to be the first creature your opponent removes out of all of your creatures. So don't expect to get too many triggers off of Judith, but hey, she does trigger off of herself too, which means she's almost a guaranteed spectacle trigger when you need her to be, and she already has the Anthem effect if her second ability isn't really doing much anyway. So first pick, very splashable outside of Rakdos as well. This seems like a great card for Orzhov as well, since they will have a bunch of little tokens to take advantage of the Anthem effect, and I think this is a card that you're snapping up first pick whenever you see her. Possibly even better than Judith, we had Rakdos, the Showstopper. 4 black and a red for a 6/6 mythic demon with Flample, flying and trample if you will. When it enters the battlefield, you do this weird thing. So you flip a coin for each creature that isn't a demon, a devil, or an imp. Okay, whatever. Destroy each creature whose coin comes up tails. So, for the record, there are not very many demons, devils, or imps. There's at least 1 demon and at least 1 imp, and Rakdos himself is a demon. I'm sorry, 1 devil and 1 imp, and Rakdos is a demon. So keep in mind, Rakdos is not affected by his own effect, so you're going to get your 6/6 trample no matter what, and then everything else that's not a devil or imp is going to have a 50% chance of dying based on a coin flip. I think this card is just great on stats alone, even though it does fall into that expensive territory, and we've already said Rakdos is probably going to want an extremely low curve, but I think the potential of this card is something that you're willing to stretch your mana for, and obviously you're going to splash it in your Gruul decks and your black decks and so on and so forth. The thing is, sometimes Rakdos will backfire and wipe some of your own creatures, while potentially not touching any of your opponent's creatures at all, but it all comes down to luck, and the fact that you'll still have your 6/6 on board no matter what can definitely justify the bad situations where you do kill more of your own creatures than your opponent's creatures. Theater of Horrors, in my opinion, is one of the strongest looking cards in the set as far as the enchantments go, and boy, are there a lot of enchantments in this set. So let's read it real quick. Theater of Horrors is 1 black-red for a rare enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your library. That card just stays exiled. It doesn't disappear at the end of turn. It just stays exiled, attached to the Theater of Horrors, and it kind of stockpiles over time. Now it says, during your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play the cards that are exiled with Theater of Horrors. So if you're comparing this card to something like Vance's Blasting Cannons or Outpost Siege, those cards give you exactly a 1-turn window to cast the cards that get exiled. That's not how Theater of Horrors works. You kind of develop a second hand every turn of the game. You add these cards to this pile, and that whole pile is up for grabs to be played once you deal damage to your opponent, although it is limited to only damage dealt during your turn, since you can't cast these spells during your opponent's turn. It also says you may play cards, which includes lands, something that Vance's Blasting Cannons would not allow you to do. On top of that, it has the activated ability for 3 and a red, deals 1 damage to a target, opponent, or planeswalker. So you get the kind of self-fueling engine off of this card alone. That's a really expensive ping, but A, it's a mana sink. If you have nothing else to do, just being able to ping your opponent with your mana is fine. And B, it lets you enable this card basically on its own, plus enable the rest of your spectacle cards. And it's the type of card that really carries itself through the remainder of the game, similar to something like Dawn of Hope, where activating the ability allows you to play the cards, allows you to play more lands, and make sure you're constantly hitting land drops, which lets you get more mana to play more spells and activate the ability more often, and it kind of feels itself at one point. So I think you're almost always casting the spell, you're taking it. I think this card is honestly even better than Rakdos and Judith as far as card advantage goes, and Rakdos is not going to be huge on card advantage, so having a rare that can basically draw you an extra hand of cards throughout the course of a game, in my opinion, is quite good, and I think Theater of Horrors is, in fact, a bomb. But with that being said, Spawn of Mayhem has to take the pick for best black card in this entire set. What an absurdity. So, Spawn of Mayhem is 2 black for a 4/4 flying trampler. It's a mythic rare demon, so thankfully you won't see it too often unless you're like me and you play against mythics all the time. But right there, 4 mana 4/4 flying and trample in a color that cares about beating your opponent down. Yeah, that's the nuts. On top of that, it has Spectacle for 1 black. 3 mana to cast your 4/4 flying trample as early as turn 3. That is the actual nuts, right? And if that weren't enough, if this wasn't just vanilla enough as a giant flying beater, it has a triggered ability. At the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to each player, you and your opponent. And then if you have 10 or less life, you put a 1/1 counter on Spawn of Mayhem. So by itself, if you play this on turn 3, or God forbid you just hard cast it on turn 4, this thing is dealing 5 damage per turn with its attack, plus its triggered ability, dealing a damage to the opponent. It enables all of your Bloodthirst for no mana every single turn with its triggered ability alone, and if for some reason you fall below 10 or less life, this card just gets bigger and probably 2 or 3 shots your opponent. So obviously a very busted card, not something I want to see on the opponent's board very often, and it's also worth noting that there are some enchantments that just lock creatures down, these Luminous Bonds type effects, if you will, and that is not extremely effective against Spawn of Mayhem. It will stop it from attacking, but it won't stop its triggered ability from turning on Spectacle for the remainder of the game, basically every single turn. So watch out if you play against this card. It is extremely powerful, and I feel like there are almost no cards I could take or even imagine taking over Spawn of Mayhem. You have to literally open the double mythic God pack to have a card better than Spawn of Mayhem in your deck. So first pick it, win with it, feel happy about it, make everybody miserable, but yeah, the card is clearly busted. And that's going to do it for Rakdos. Next, we'll be switching up colors completely and talking about the Popo of Ravnica, Azorius, and spoiler alert, I'm way less excited about them than I am for Rakdos. Which is not to say that they're bad, but I don't think they're as cool. Rakdos is kind of sweet with their Carney feel, and I think their mechanic is well supported. Keep in mind, Rakdos is the one guild in this set that's going to take work to make its deck work, right? Again, Adapt just works. Afterlife just works. Addendum just asks you to kind of change the timing of what you normally do. But Rakdos and Spectacle don't even work unless you're constantly dealing damage to the opponent. But thankfully, I think they support it enough that it'll work. Anyway, that's going to be part 1 of our video wrapped up here. Stay tuned for our review of all of the Azorius cards. And keep in mind, if I didn't cover a red or black card in this video, it'll be in the video at the end of this series where I cover the non-guild specific cards. So with all that being said, thank you for watching. This is Timothy here with Mana Rocks. Join us next time for part 2 of our Ravnica Allegiance Limited review, and I'll see you there.